The grand marble pavilion was suffocatingly silent. Hundreds of elite courtiers stared in disgust at the dark soot staining Valka's fingertips. She stood on the golden dais wearing a ceremonial gown of white silk that felt exactly like a burial. Her hands were supposed to be soft and pristine for the royal mating ceremony. Instead, they bore the permanent rough scars of a woman who spent her nights studying thermodynamics rather than practicing courtly submission. Alpha King Kael looked down at her from his elevated throne. His piercing silver eyes held absolutely zero warmth. He did not see a brilliant mind. He saw a defective Omega obsessed with dirt and mechanics completely unbefitting of his magnificent court. "You offer me blistered hands and the smell of burning coal." His deep alpha voice vibrated through the massive hall carrying the crushing weight of absolute finality. "I require a high Omega of flawless aesthetic perfection, not a filthy mechanic hiding behind a silk veil. You're an absolute disgrace to your sacred bloodline, Valka. I reject this bond entirely. I banish you to the frozen northern wastelands where your crude obsession with the dirt truly belongs." Valka did not shed a single tear. She looked at the arrogant king who valued empty aesthetics over a surviving mind. She turned her back on the golden throne and walked out into the howling blizzard entirely alone. Which country are you listening from? Please comment below. I would love to know how far this story reaches. The northern wasteland was a brutal, unforgiving graveyard of jagged ice and relentless wind. It was a place designed to break the human spirit and shatter anyone foolish enough to defy the cold. Valka stood knee-deep in the freezing snow, wrapping a thick layer of woven hemp around the rotting wooden beams of a collapsed peasant cabin. Her breath plumed in the frigid air, transforming into a fine mist of white frost that clung to her dark eyelashes. The white silk ceremonial gown from her banishment was long gone, replaced by heavy layered wool and thick leather boots she had stitched together with her own blistered hands. The slums of the Outer Rim were filled with the forgotten souls of the kingdom. These were the elderly, the sick, and the children who had been pushed out of the wealthy capital and left to rot in the frozen mud. When Valka first arrived, the villagers looked at her with pity, expecting the fragile exiled Omega to perish within a week. They did not understand that the fire burning inside her mind was far hotter than any hearth in the royal palace. Valka tightened the hemp rope, feeling the familiar satisfying burn in her shoulder muscles. She secured the perimeter of the small dwelling, effectively blocking the lethal drafting wind that threatened to freeze the family sleeping inside. A young mother huddled in the doorway, clutching a shivering infant to her chest. Her eyes were wide with desperate gratitude. Valka offered a gentle nod, pressing a small bundle of dried pine needles into the mother's trembling hands. She did not need words to communicate her absolute dedication. Their survival had become her ultimate purpose. Walking back to her makeshift sanctuary at the edge of the jagged cliffs, Valka allowed herself a rare moment of reflection. The memory of the grand marble pavilion still echoed in the dark corners of her mind. The crushing weight of the king's rejection, the collective gasp of the elite courtiers, and the freezing silver of Kael's eyes when he called her a filthy mechanic. For the first few months, the phantom sting of his words had kept her awake, drowning her in the heavy, suffocating pain of an Omega separated from her destined Alpha. She had cried until her tears literally froze against her cheeks. But the brutal reality of the North left absolutely no room for self-pity. Grief was a luxury she simply could not afford when children were losing their fingers to frostbite. Valka replaced the hollow ache in her chest with the solid grounding weight of practical science. She stopped looking back at the golden capital and started looking deeply at the frozen earth. Her soot-stained hands became her greatest weapons against the White Death. She pushed open the heavy wooden door of her cabin, stepping into the dim, cramped space. The walls were lined with strange handmade contraptions. Coils of beaten copper wire, glass vials filled with mysterious liquids, and heavy chunks of compressed peat covered every available surface. In the center of the room stood her prized creation, a towering barometric thermometer constructed from salvaged blown glass and purified mercury she had painfully extracted from the frozen riverbed. Valka approached the glass column, her pale eyes narrowing with intense clinical focus. The silver liquid inside the thick tube was dropping at a terrifying rate. It had sunk past the lowest numerical mark, completely vanishing. The air pressure in the room felt exceptionally heavy, pressing against her eardrums with a dull throbbing ache. She quickly unrolled a massive sheet of rough parchment, spreading it across her cluttered workbench. She picked up a thick stick of black charcoal and began to furiously calculate the thermal drag in the rapidly shifting wind vectors. Her mind operated like a flawless mechanical engine, translating the raw atmospheric data into fluid, terrifying geometry. The numbers painted a devastating, undeniable picture. A catastrophic drop in global temperature was rapidly approaching. This was not the standard harsh winter the northern peasants were accustomed to surviving. The mathematics indicated an absolute atmospheric collapse, an unprecedented 100-year freeze that would turn the entire continent into a solid block of dead ice. Burning simple firewood in drafty stone hearths would be utterly useless against the sheer penetrating violence of the approaching mega blizzard. Valka stared at the soot-stained equations, her heart hammering against her ribs. The forgotten people of the Outer Rim barely had enough chopped wood to survive a normal snowstorm. When this monstrous freeze finally struck, it would slaughter thousands of innocent peasants within hours. The frail wooden cabins would shatter under the atmospheric pressure, and the blood in their veins would freeze solid. She looked down at her permanently scarred hands. She refused to let the cold claim these people. If traditional fire was no longer enough to keep the White Death at bay, she would have to invent an entirely new way to capture heat. She grabbed her heavy leather satchel and a thick iron pickaxe, strapping them securely to her back. The answer to saving the village was not waiting in the sky. The answer was waiting deep inside the lethal, uncharted ice caves of the northern mountains. The ascent into the jagged peaks of the northern spine was a suicide mission for any ordinary person. The wind screamed through the narrow canyons, tearing at Valka's heavy wool coat, like invisible claws attempting to drag her off the icy ledge. She climbed for hours, driving her iron pickaxe into the sheer blue ice, pulling her aching body upward inch by agonizing inch. Her lungs burned with every frozen breath, but her mind remained perfectly sharp. She was tracking a very specific geological anomaly. Months of studying the subtle melting patterns of the snowpack and analyzing the faint sulfuric scent in the northern gales had led her to this exact remote location. She reached the summit of the ridge and slipped into a narrow, jagged fissure hidden behind a massive curtain of frozen waterfall. The transition from the screaming blizzard outside to the heavy echoing silence of the subterranean cavern was instantly disorienting. Valka ignited a small tallow torch. The flickering orange flame illuminated a breathtaking alien world. The cavern was a massive subterranean junction where the freezing permafrost of the surface collided directly with the deep geothermal vents of the ancient Earth. Huge jagged stalactites of clear blue ice hung suspended over bubbling pools of thick black volcanic mud. The air was a dangerous, intoxicating mixture of freezing vapor and suffocating sulfur. Valka moved carefully across the slippery obsidian floor, her eyes scanning the walls with predatory focus. She was looking for the exact point of intersection, the rare geological zone where extreme heat and extreme cold fought to a permanent standstill. Deeper into the cavern, she finally found it. Clinging to the porous volcanic rock walls near a dormant geothermal vent was a thick fibrous substance. It looked like a heavy gray paste woven with thousands of microscopic crystalline veins. She drove her iron pickaxe into the wall, chipping away a large chunk of the material. It was surprisingly light, weighing almost nothing in her palm. Valka knelt on the cavern floor, pulling a small set of brass measuring tools from her leather satchel. She crushed a piece of the strange material between her calloused fingers. It was a miraculous natural composite. The foundation was a highly porous volcanic pumice, created by deep earth pressure, but the pores were completely filled and sealed by a thick, translucent subterranean frost sap. The unique sap had bled from the ancient roots of the mountain pines and fused perfectly with the cooling volcanic ash. It was time to test the thermodynamic threshold. Valka pulled a small, heavy iron crucible from her bag. She packed the interior of the metal cup with a thick layer of the gray composite paste, leaving a tiny hollow cavity in the exact. She then took a single glowing red coal from her portable heating pouch and dropped it directly into the hollow center, sealing the top with another layer of the paste. Under normal circumstances, the freezing ambient temperature of the ice cave would extinguish the small coal within seconds, rendering the iron crucible completely cold to the touch. Valka waited, counting the seconds in her head. 1 minute passed. 5 minutes passed. She placed her bare, scarred hand directly against the outside of the iron crucible. It was freezing cold. The external metal had entirely absorbed the ambient temperature of the cavern. Her heart leaped against her ribs. She cracked the thick layer of the gray paste open. A sudden, intense wave of pure, concentrated heat hit her face. The small red coal was not just surviving. It was glowing with a blinding, fierce intensity, burning hotter and brighter than when she had first placed it inside. The volcanic pumice and frost sap composite had created an absolute, impenetrable thermal vacuum. It completely trapped the radiant heat of the coal, preventing even a fraction of a degree from escaping into the freezing air, while simultaneously blocking the external cold from penetrating the core. It was a physical impossibility, a thermodynamic miracle, naturally synthesized in the dark. Valka stared at the glowing coal, her brilliant mind rapidly scaling the mathematical possibilities. A layer of this composite just 2 inches thick applied to the walls of a wooden cabin would trap the ambient body heat of a family with absolute flawless efficiency. They would not need to burn entire forests to survive the winter. A single small bundle of twigs burning in a central hearth would heat a sealed room for an entire week. The material was a supreme insulator, a flawless shield against the White Death. Valka looked at her soot-stained hands, the very hands King Kael had found so offensive. He had exiled her to the ice, expecting her fragile Omega body to shatter under the weight of the winter. He expected her to fade into a silent, invisible ghost. Instead, her brilliant mind had just discovered the absolute mastery of warmth. She began frantically harvesting the miraculous composite, swinging her heavy iron pickaxe with raw, unstoppable strength. The sound of metal striking rock echoed through the massive cavern. She filled her heavy leather sacks to the brim, completely ignoring the exhausting burn in her arms. She had to haul this raw material back, synthesize the thermal paste, and coat every single peasant cabin before the catastrophic 100-year freeze descended from the sky. The memory of the cold was a living, breathing monster that haunted the dark corners of her mind. Valka hauled the heavy leather sacks of volcanic composite through the howling wind, her mind slipping backward into the brutal winter of her childhood. She was 10 years old, sitting on the frozen dirt floor of an outer ring tenement. Her younger sister Alara lay in her lap, her tiny body shaking violently. The hearth was completely empty. A thick layer of white frost crept across the stone floor, like a slow-moving disease. Just hours earlier, the royal guards had marched through their district, confiscating every remaining log of firewood for the grand marble palace. The Alpha elites required towering bonfires to warm their vast empty banquet halls, while the common Omegas and peasants were left to endure the freezing dark. Valka remembered rubbing her small hands together, creating pathetic sparks of friction, desperately trying to transfer the meager heat into Alara's freezing skin. It was mathematically impossible. The thermal drain of the freezing room simply overpowered her fragile human effort. By dawn, the shaking had stopped completely. Alara was gone, stolen by the unyielding physics of the cold. The elite courtiers had stolen the fire, and Valka had spent every single day since attempting to mathematically conquer the ice. She plunged her hands into the black soot of every chimney she could find, desperately seeking the architectural secrets of capturing heat, ensuring no one would ever freeze in her arms again. The crushing weight of the memory vanished as she kicked open the heavy wooden doors of the village community hall. The peasants huddled together, wrapped in threadbare blankets, their faces pale with terror as the barometric pressure continued its devastating plunge. Valka dumped the massive leather sacks onto the floor. The heavy chunks of frost, sap, and volcanic pumice spilled across the wooden boards. She did not waste time with comforting platitudes. She grabbed a heavy iron mixing vat and began issuing rapid, precise commands. They had exactly 4 hours before the 100-year freeze shattered the sky. "Bring boiling water and crushed limestone," Valka commanded, her voice cutting through the panic with absolute authority. "We have to synthesize the thermal paste before the atmospheric vacuum drops below zero." The villagers hesitated for a fraction of a second before scrambling to obey. They had watched this exiled Omega survive the brutal wasteland for months, and her towering intellect commanded a respect that King Kael could never achieve with his iron sword. Men and women worked in frantic synchronization, mashing the volcanic pumice and melting the translucent frost sap. The chemical reaction produced a thick gray mortar that smelled of ancient earth and raw ozone. Valka led the charge, her permanently scarred hands sinking deep into the heavy paste. She moved from cabin to cabin, slapping thick layers of the miraculous composite onto the rotting wooden walls, sealing every drafty crack in freezing timber. The physical labor was agonizing. Her muscles screamed under the immense weight of the wet mortar, but the phantom memory of Alara's freezing skin drove her forward. She coated the final roof beam of the outermost cabin just as the sky turned a sickening shade of bruised purple. The ambient light vanished entirely, swallowed by a towering wall of churning black clouds. The wind ceased entirely, leaving behind a terrifying heavy silence. It was the deep inhaled breath of a monster preparing to get inside. Valka yelled, pushing the last lingering children through the heavy wooden door of the insulated community hall. She slammed the door shut, plunging the room into darkness save for a single tiny bundle of dry twigs burning quietly in the central stone hearth. Then the mega blizzard struck. The sheer acoustic violence of the wind hitting the exterior walls sounded like 1,000 iron cannons firing simultaneously. The wooden beams groaned loudly under the devastating atmospheric pressure, but the gray thermal paste held absolutely firm. Inside the hall, a profound miracle occurred. The tiny burning bundle of twigs radiated a small pocket of heat that hit the coated walls and instantly bounced back. The volcanic composite trapped the thermal energy, perfectly magnifying and circulating the warmth throughout the enclosed space. Within minutes, the freezing villagers began to unwrap their heavy blankets. The air grew sweltering and thick. Children who had been shivering violently all morning were now wiping sweat from their brows, laughing as the impossible warmth settled into their bones. Valka sat near the doorway, her exhausted body practically vibrating with relief. She had successfully conquered the White Death. Her scientific genius had shielded the forgotten people from the worst storm in a century. But as she leaned her head against the heavily insulated wood, her sharp mind calculated the sheer massive scale of the atmospheric collapse raging outside. The mega blizzard was not a localized event. It was a continent-spanning anomaly, roaring southward with unstoppable malice. It was heading directly toward the capital. It was heading straight for the grand marble pavilions, the arrogant councilman, and the invincible Alpha King who possessed all the gold in the world but lacked the single thermodynamic secret required to survive the night. The grand marble pavilion of the capital city was not built to withstand the wrath of the sky. It was designed to project absolute military dominance and aesthetic perfection. The towering vaulted ceilings and wide, elegant archways were architectural masterpieces that now functioned as lethal wind tunnels. The catastrophic 100-year freeze hit the capital with the force of a falling mountain, instantly shattering the illusion of alpha supremacy. The beautifully polished stone floors transformed into sheets of deadly ice, and the heavy silk banners snapped and froze solid in the howling wind. King Kael stood in the center of the grand courtyard, watching his invincible empire collapse. The massive roaring bonfires that usually warmed the royal elite were failing completely. The voracious freezing wind swallowed the thermal energy the second it left, the flames pulling the heat straight up into the violent black sky. Kael watched his most elite soldiers, the most feared alpha warriors on the entire continent, shivering violently huddled around the dying fires. Their heavy iron armor, the ultimate symbol of their military might, had become a lethal trap. The frozen metal violently conducted the plunging temperatures directly into their flesh, drawing the vital heat straight out of their bones. Strip the armor, Kael bellowed, his deep voice barely cutting through the deafening roar of the mega blizzard. Get the iron off your skin now. His generals scrambled to obey, their freezing fingers fumbling uselessly against the heavy leather straps and frozen iron buckles. It was a horrifying sight. Men who had conquered entire neighboring kingdoms were weeping in the snow, entirely defeated by the invisible violence of the air. Kael grabbed a freezing soldier by the shoulder, forcefully tearing the iron breastplate from the man's chest, but it was too late. The young Alpha's lips were already a terrifying shade of blue, and his eyes were rolling backward into his skull. The White Death did not care about military rank or royal bloodlines. It simply devoured everything that lacked the mechanical knowledge to resist it. Kael stepped back, his heavy boots crunching against the frozen marble. A profound, sickening wave of realization washed over him. He possessed vaults overflowing with raw gold. He commanded 10,000 iron swords. He wore a crown forged from the rarest metals on earth. Yet standing in the middle of his dying capital, every single piece of his traditional power was utterly worthless. You could not bribe a blizzard with gold. You could not stab the freezing wind with an iron blade. You could not demand submission from the dropping barometric pressure. His absolute alpha authority ended the exact moment the sky decided to freeze the world. He looked down at his own hands. They were pristine, unblemished, and strong, the hands of a conqueror, but they were entirely incapable of creating warmth. For the first time in his life, the invincible king felt the crushing, paralyzing grip of true helplessness. He thought of the fragile Omega he had banished to the northern wastelands. He had exiled Valka because her hands were stained with soot and obsessed with the mechanics of the hearth. He had called her crude. He had called her useless. Now, as he watched his royal guard freeze to death on the pristine marble floors, he finally understood the sheer towering magnitude of his own absolute arrogance. A heavy wooden door at the edge of the courtyard violently burst open. A royal border scout stumbled into the snow-covered courtyard, his heavy fur cloak completely white with ice. The man collapsed onto his hands and knees, dragging himself toward the dying bonfire. Kael rushed forward, hauling the half-frozen scout to his feet. The outer ring, Kael demanded, shaking the man to keep his eyes open. Have the slums completely fallen? The scout coughed violently, a fine mist of blood and frost escaping his cracked lips. They are surviving, my king. The scout wheezed, his voice a raspy, desperate whisper. It is a miracle in the dark. The wooden cabins in the frozen wastes, they are radiating heat. They are burning almost nothing, but the people inside are sweating. The entire northern rim is alive. Kael stared at the scout, his silver eyes widening in absolute shock. The capital was burning, entire forests of timber and freezing to death, while the impoverished slums were thriving in the teeth of the mega blizzard. It was a thermodynamic impossibility. Who is doing this? Kael asked, his voice tight with raw desperation. Who controls the heat? They call her the Warmaker, the scout gasped, collapsing backward into the snow. A ghost in the ice? She trapped the fire in the walls. The scout lost consciousness, but his words continued to ring violently inside Kael's mind. A ghost in the ice. Someone in the frozen wastelands possessed an intellect so towering they had mathematically defeated the apocalypse. If his capital remained in the marble pavilion, they would all be dead within 3 days. His traditional pride was completely irrelevant now. The only thing that mattered was survival. Gather the vanguard. Kael turned to his surviving generals, his voice carrying a new desperate resolve. Leave the gold. Leave the heavy armor. Take only the thickest furs and the strongest horses. We cannot fight this storm with swords. We are abandoning the capital. Where are we going? His lead commander asked, his voice trembling violently in the cold. We march into the northern wastes, Kael declared, staring out into the churning black wall of the mega blizzard. We are going to find the Warmaker. And we are going to beg for her mercy. Kael pulled his thick royal furs tightly around his broad shoulders and stepped directly into the blinding white void of the lethal snow, setting his course straight toward the very hell, where he had banished the only mind capable of saving them all. The march into the northern wastes was a descent into an absolute freezing hell. The catastrophic whiteout erased the sky and the earth, leaving only a blinding, screaming void that tore at the royal vanguard. Kael trudged at the head of the small column, pulling his massive warhorse by its leather reins. The magnificent beasts that had charged fearlessly through enemy battle lines were now collapsing in the deep snow, their massive chests heaving as their lungs filled with ice. The royal alpha warriors who had marched out of the capital with desperate hope were rapidly losing their battle against the elements. They tied thick ropes around their waists, linking themselves together like exhausted prisoners stumbling blindly through the endless dunes of snow. Every step required monumental physical effort. The snow was waist-deep and packed with jagged shards of broken ice that sliced through their thick leather boots. Kael felt his core temperature dropping at a terrifying rate. The thick layers of royal fur wrapped around his broad shoulders were completely failing to trap his body heat. The wind sliced right through the heavy pelts, pulling the warmth from his blood and leaving a dull, agonizing numbness in his extremities. He looked back at his surviving men. 10 of his most elite generals had already fallen, their bodies completely swallowed by the shifting white drifts before anyone could pull them back to their feet. The king of the realm dropped to his knees. The snow immediately rushed in, burying his thighs and rising up to his chest. He released the leather reins of his dying horse, his numb fingers completely unable to grip the thick straps. Kael looked down at his pristine hands. The skin was pale blue and entirely devoid of feeling. The invincible conqueror was going to die in the mud, exactly where he had exiled the only woman who possessed the intellect to save him. The profound irony of his impending death settled heavily in his fading mind. He did not ask the universe for mercy. He knew he deserved this freezing demise. His vision began to narrow, closing in at the edges with a dark, peaceful gray. The roaring wind faded into a distant hollow hum. He closed his eyes, ready to surrender his arrogant soul to the absolute mastery of the winter. Miles away in the heart of the Outer Rim slums, Valka stood inside her sweltering sanctuary. The heavy wooden door was firmly sealed, blocking out the screaming violence of the mega blizzard. The thick layer of gray volcanic thermal paste coating the walls radiated a steady, intense heat, wrapping her in a protective, invisible blanket. She stood near the roaring barometric column, monitoring the catastrophic atmospheric drop with clinical precision. Her surviving people were safe, huddled together in the insulated community halls, completely untouched by the White Death. But a sudden violent tremor ripped through her chest. It was not a physical chill. It was a deep metaphysical agonizing pull vibrating through the very foundation of her biology. The primal Omega bond, which she had successfully buried beneath mountains of mathematical equations and thermal blueprints, suddenly flared with terrifying intensity. She gasped, gripping the edge of her wooden workbench, her heart hammered against her ribs, completely out of sync with her own biology. She was feeling the exact moment her fated mate began to freeze to death. She closed her eyes, fighting the intense wave of phantom cold creeping up her spine. Kael had rejected her. He had humiliated her in front of the entire elite court and cast her out to die in the freezing mud. Logic and self-preservation demanded that she stay inside her sweltering sanctuary and let the arrogant king pay the ultimate price for his blind traditional pride. He was the architect of his own icy grave. But the memory of her little sister freezing on the dirt floor flared brilliantly in her mind. Valka had sworn a sacred oath to the universe that she would never allow another human being to succumb to the White Death if she had the scientific power to prevent it. Her morality was not conditional. She did not hoard her warmth for those who deserved it. She wielded her science as an absolute shield for the fragile human body, regardless of the arrogant soul trapped inside it. Valka turned away from the barometric column and moved toward the heavy iron hooks on the wall. She pulled down her specialized thermal survival gear. It was a thick, heavy coat woven from raw wool and entirely saturated with the volcanic pumice and frost sap composite. She wrapped the heavy insulated material around her fragile frame, pulling the thick hood over her dark hair. She grabbed a long, heavy iron staff tipped with a glowing red coal encased in a thick sphere of thermal paste, acting as a brilliant, radiant lantern in the dark. She pushed open the heavy wooden door, stepping directly into the teeth of the catastrophic whiteout. The screaming wind slammed into her, attempting to push her backward, but the thermal gear functioned flawlessly. The lethal cold simply bounced off the gray composite, completely unable to penetrate her protective shell. She was a walking fortress of thermodynamic perfection. Valka walked into the blinding white void, guided entirely by the violent, painful tugging of the fading bond in her chest. She moved with steady mechanical precision, calculating the wind vectors and the shifting snowdrifts to conserve her energy. The storm raged around her, entirely unable to touch the heat trapped against her skin. Deep in the snowdrifts, Kael's heart slowed to a barely perceptible rhythm. His thick eyelashes were frozen together, completely blinding him to the physical world. The darkness was absolute and heavy, pulling his mind down into a quiet, freezing abyss. But suddenly, a faint, unnatural warmth brushed against his frozen cheek. It was a tiny, impossible fraction of heat, piercing through the absolute zero of the wasteland. He forced his heavy eyelids open, cracking the ice, sealing his vision. Through the swirling wall of the mega blizzard, a figure emerged from the whiteout. The figure glowed with a brilliant, radiant orange light, carrying a towering iron staff. The violent wind seemed to part completely around her fragile frame, refusing to touch her. Kael stared through his fading vision as the glowing figure reached his side. She knelt in the deep snow, completely unaffected by the lethal cold. Small, scarred hands reached out, gripping his heavy, frozen shoulders with surprising physical strength. The intense, radiant heat, pouring off her specialized coat, washed over his freezing face, pulling him back from the absolute edge of death. He did not know if he was looking at an angel or a hallucination, but the absolute, overwhelming heat of her presence completely shattered the remaining fragments of his alpha pride before the darkness finally claimed him. The transition from the absolute zero of the whiteout to the impossible, sweltering heat was violent and disorienting. Kael expected the afterlife to be a silent, frozen abyss. Instead, he woke to the sensation of thick, heavy sweat rolling down his temples. His lungs, which had been crystallized with ice only hours before, now expanded effortlessly, drawing in air that tasted of raw ozone and warm earth. He groaned, a low, rough sound tearing from his raw throat, and forced his heavy eyelids open. He was lying on a simple wooden cot. Thick layers of woven hemp and raw wool covered his chest, but the ambient temperature of the room was so staggeringly high, he immediately shoved the heavy blankets aside. His bare skin glistened with sweat in the dim light. He sat up, his muscles trembling with the phantom ache of the cold, but his core was entirely thawed. The blood rushing through his veins was hot and vibrant, returning life to a body that had fully surrendered to the white death. He looked around the small enclosed space, his alpha instincts instantly analyzing the environment for threats. There were no elite guards, there were no heavy iron shields. It was a humble peasant cabin built from rotting timber and salvaged stone. Yet the air inside the room was practically boiling, mimicking the deep, sweltering heat of the midsummer sun. Kael turned his head, searching for the massive, roaring bonfire required to generate such overwhelming thermal energy. He expected to find half a forest burning in a massive stone hearth, just like the opulent fireplaces in his grand marble pavilion. Instead, his silver eyes landed on a tiny iron grate in the center of the room. A single minuscule bundle of dried twigs burned quietly, casting a soft orange glow across the floor. It was impossible. A fire that small could not even warm a pair of hands, let alone heat an entire cabin in the middle of a mega blizzard. Kael stared at the tiny flame, his logical military mind completely failing to comprehend the physics unfolding before him. He had spent his entire life commanding brute force, believing that absolute power required massive physical fuel. He looked at the walls. Every inch of the wooden interior was coated in a thick, heavy gray paste. The materials seemed to absorb the tiny fraction of heat from the twigs, magnifying it and reflecting it back into the room with absolute, flawless efficiency. He reached out, placing his broad palm against the gray mortar. The material was hot to the touch, radiating a steady, impenetrable barrier against the howling apocalyptic storm raging just inches away on the outside. It was a thermodynamic miracle. It was an absolute mastery of the elements that rendered his entire royal armory completely obsolete. The architect had not fought the winter with swords or arrogance. They had fought it with a towering, supreme intellect. The soft scratching sound of charcoal against rough parchment drew his attention to the far corner of the room. A figure stood at a cluttered wooden workbench, surrounded by towering glass barometric columns and heavy copper coils. The walls above the desk were covered in massive architectural blueprints, detailing the precise atmospheric vectors and thermal limits of the gray paste. Kael recognized the absolute genius required to draft those equations. The architect of this sweltering sanctuary possessed an intellect that dwarfed the combined knowledge of his entire royal court. This was the Warmaker. This was the savior who had pulled him from the frozen mud and dragged his massive dying frame to safety. "I owe you my life," Kael spoke, his voice a raspy, broken shadow of its usual commanding rumble. "My capital has fallen. My gold is useless. Tell me your name, so I may offer you whatever remains of my broken kingdom." The scratching of the charcoal stopped. The figure slowly turned around, stepping away from the complex blueprints and into the soft orange light of the central hearth. She did not bow. She did not lower her gaze in submission. She stood with the absolute quiet authority of a deity looking down at a mortal who had finally realized the limits of his own power. Pale eyes met his stunned silver gaze. Her dark hair was tied back, practically keeping it away from her face. She wore a heavy canvas tunic stained with black soot and the gray volcanic paste. But it was her hands that completely shattered his reality. They were heavily scarred, rough, and blistered from relentless mechanical labor and exposure to the brutal elements. They were the exact same hands he had publicly mocked in the Grand Marble Pavilion. It was Valka. The breath vanished from Kael's lungs, as if the freezing wind had suddenly ripped through the insulated walls. The realization struck him with the devastating kinetic force of a falling mountain. The brilliant godlike architect who had mathematically conquered the White Death was the exact same fragile Omega he had discarded. The visionary savior of the Northern Rim was the mate he had humiliated and banished for lacking aesthetic perfection. Kael stared at her, paralyzed by a profound, agonizing wave of realization. He remembered the exact arrogant tone of his voice when he called her a filthy mechanic. He remembered the collective laughter of his elite courtiers echoing through the grand hall. He remembered watching her walk alone into the freezing dark while he returned to his warm golden throne. He had thrown away the most magnificent mind in the history of his empire, simply because her brilliance did not fit into his narrow, primitive definition of beauty. Now his golden throne was a frozen tomb, and he was sitting in her mud, entirely dependent on her towering genius, simply to draw his next breath. The absolute magnitude of his mistake crushed his chest. His alpha pride, the foundation of his entire existence, completely evaporated in the sweltering heat of her sanctuary. He did not see a defective Omega anymore. He saw a magnificent master of the world, a woman who had taken the brutal, freezing hell he had condemned her to and transformed it into an impenetrable fortress of warmth. You're listening to this story on the Alpha King Secrets channel. Are you enjoying today's story? Let us know what you think in the comments below. Now, let's get back to the story. Valka looked at his pristine, trembling hands resting on the rough wooden cot. She did not offer a cruel smile or a vindictive comment. She simply picked up a hot iron cup of pine needle tea. The slow, agonizing burn of his total redemption had only just begun. Valka extended the hot iron cup, her scarred fingers hovering mere inches from his pristine hands. Kael took the cup, his silver eyes never leaving her face. He drank deeply, the scalding liquid grounding him in the undeniable physical reality of his survival. Valka stepped back, reclaiming her space. She moved to the thick wooden shutters covering the small window and unlatched a narrow viewing pane. A blast of freezing air hissed against the glass, instantly melting against the ambient heat of the room. "Look," Valka instructed, her voice completely devoid of the deferential tremble expected from a banished Omega. Kael pushed the heavy blankets aside and stood. His towering physical presence felt entirely insignificant as he approached the window, resting his hands on the wooden sill. Outside, the mega blizzard raged with apocalyptic fury. The wind screamed in a blinding white vortex, a storm that was currently slaughtering his elite armies in the marble capital. Yet nestled within the howling chaos, the outer rim slums were completely untouched. The rotting timber cabins glowed with a faint, steady warmth. Villagers moved safely through narrow covered trenches dug between the structures. Children were playing near a communal insulated hearth, their faces flushed and sweating, despite the lethal sub-zero atmosphere raging just 10 feet above their heads. It was a thriving, breathing society existing in the exact epicenter of absolute death. "My capital is a graveyard of frozen gold," Kael murmured, the raw agony of his failure bleeding into the quiet room. "My strongest generals are dying in their iron armor. And here the forgotten peasants are sweating in the snow. How did you conquer the sky?" Valka walked over to her cluttered workbench, picking up a heavy chunk of the raw gray composite. She did not look at him with the wide-eyed adoration of a mate finally reunited with her alpha. She looked at him with the cold, clinical detachment of a master engineer, addressing a fundamentally flawed architectural design. "I did not conquer the sky," Valka corrected, tossing the heavy chunk of pumice onto the wooden table with a dull thud. "I stopped fighting it. You build massive, roaring bonfires in drafty marble halls, trying to overpower the winter with brute force. You throw massive amounts of energy into a void, expecting the void to submit. But the cold does not care about your strength, King Kael. The cold is a mathematical absolute. It only respects a superior barrier." She gestured toward the architectural blueprints pinned to the wall above her desk. "Deep in the northern ice caves where the geothermal vents meet the permafrost, I discovered a natural anomaly. a highly porous volcanic pumice fused with subterranean frost sap. When synthesized, it creates an absolute thermal vacuum. It does not generate heat, it simply refuses to let a single fraction of a degree escape. The tiny bundle of twigs burning in that grate produces enough kinetic energy to heat this entire room because the walls trap and magnify the radiation flawlessly. Kael stared at the complex geometric vectors and thermodynamic equations covering the yellowed parchment. The sheer intellectual magnitude of her work was staggering. She had mapped the invisible laws of nature, transforming dirt and sap into an impenetrable shield. While his Royal Academy was obsessed with polishing swords and reciting ancient lineage chants, this solitary discarded woman had solved the greatest existential threat their world had ever faced. You built an empire on the illusion of power, Valka continued, her pale eyes tracking the violent atmospheric drop on her barometric column. You hoarded the firewood. You demanded aesthetic perfection. You exiled the minds that did not fit perfectly into your rigid, fragile traditions. Now the tradition is freezing to death. The silence that followed her words was heavier than the iron armor he had abandoned in the snow. Kael felt the crushing, undeniable weight of her genius bearing down on his soul. Every single syllable she spoke was a flawless, irrefutable strike against his monumental arrogance. He looked at her heavily scarred hands, the blistered fingers stained with black soot and gray chemical mortar. Those hands had crawled through lethal ice caves, synthesized thermal paste, and personally insulated an entire village to save the very people he had neglected. His pristine, perfectly manicured hands had done absolutely nothing but point a finger of banishment. A profound, agonizing regret ripped through his chest, far more painful than the physical bite of the frost. He had possessed the most magnificent treasure in the known world, a mate with the intellectual power to reshape reality, and he had thrown her into the mud. The towering Alpha who commanded armies suddenly felt smaller than the microscopic frost sap clinging to the pumice. He wanted to drop to his knees. He wanted to scream his apologies into the sweltering air and beg for a forgiveness he knew he had not earned. But the quiet tension of his profound realization was brutally interrupted. The heavy glass casing of Valka's barometric column suddenly let out a sharp, terrifying crack. Valka lunged toward the workbench, her clinical detachment vanishing instantly. The silver mercury inside the thick tube was plummeting faster than gravity, dropping completely out of sight. The air pressure inside the sealed cabin violently popped Kael's eardrums. The eye of the storm is collapsing, Valka gasped, staring at the shattered glass. The ambient temperature outside is dropping past the failure point of the external wood. The thermal paste will hold the heat, but the structural timber is going to snap. Before Kael could process the architectural warning, a deafening explosion echoed from the village square. The massive roof of the central community hall, loaded with tons of fresh ice and weakened by the sheer kinetic violence of the wind, had just caved in, exposing 50 vulnerable peasants directly to the lethal whiteout. The shrieking wind tore through the shattered roof of the community hall, bringing an absolute tidal wave of freezing death into the once warm sanctuary. Valka did not hesitate. She sprinted out of her cabin, plunging straight into the blinding whiteout, with Kael following closely behind. The village square was a chaotic nightmare of splintered timber and terrified screams. The lethal ambient temperature immediately began devouring the trapped peasants. Valka dropped to her knees in the snow, digging frantically through the heavy wreckage. Her brilliant mind instantly mapped the structural collapse, calculating exactly which massive pine beams could be shifted without causing a secondary cave-in. Lift the central pillar, she commanded, pointing a soot-stained finger toward a massive wooden beam pinning a family of 4. Kael did not pause to question her geometry. He lunged forward, driving his broad shoulders directly under the heavy timber. His massive alpha muscles strained his boots, slipping in the frozen mud, but he channeled every ounce of his raw physical power into executing her precise command. With a deafening roar, he hoisted the crushing weight upward, creating a narrow escape tunnel. Valka crawled directly into the freezing gap, dragging the terrified children out of the rubble one by one. They worked in frantic synchronization. The king who had once conquered nations with an iron sword now served as the physical fulcrum for an exiled Omega's rescue mission. But the environmental cost was catastrophic. In her desperate rush to shield a freezing infant from the howling wind, Valka tore her specialized thermal coat against the jagged piece of splintered wood. The protective gray composite ruptured. The lethal sub-zero air instantly flooded through the breach, biting directly into her fragile skin. For 3 grueling hours, they battled the White Death, pulling every surviving villager from the wreckage and relocating them to the intact auxiliary cabins. Valka sealed the final door, her hands moving with frantic mechanical precision to apply a fresh layer of the thermal paste over the seams. The instant the atmospheric lock clicked shut, her physical strength completely gave way. She collapsed against the wooden door, sliding down to the cold floor. The absolute physical exhaustion and the lethal exposure had finally bypassed her relentless willpower. Her lips were a terrifying shade of pale blue and violent tremors racked her small frame. The ambient heat of the auxiliary cabin was slowly building, but the cold had already sunk too deeply into her marrow. Kael stood a few feet away, his chest heaving as he watched the invincible Warmaker finally shatter. A profound, agonizing wave of panic seized his heart. He crossed the room in 2 massive strides, dropping heavily to his knees on the wooden floor right beside her. He looked at the jagged tear in her coat and the pale, freezing skin beneath it. She had sacrificed her own perfect thermal shield to save the lowest peasants of his kingdom, while he had sat on a golden throne and hoarded the warmth. Without a single second of hesitation, Kael reached up and unclasped the heavy iron brooches at his collar. He stripped off his magnificent royal furs, the thickest and most luxurious pelts in the entire known world. The heavy mantle was the absolute symbol of his supreme authority, the very garment that defined his Alpha kingship. He did not care. He would gladly burn his crown to ash if it meant keeping her heart beating. He wrapped the massive, heavy furs tightly around her shivering shoulders, burying her fragile frame in the dense protective warmth. He pulled the thick collar up around her neck, his large hands hovering gently over her cold cheeks. "Look at me," Kael whispered, his deep voice breaking completely under the crushing weight of his absolute remorse. "Valka, please look at me." Valka slowly forced her heavy eyelids open. Her pale eyes met his intense silver gaze. She expected to see the arrogant conqueror, but she saw only a broken man begging for mercy. "I was entirely blind," he spoke, his voice vibrating with raw, agonizing honesty that filled the quiet space between them. "I looked at the vast infinite sky and demanded that it bow to my gold. I looked at your towering, beautiful intellect and punished you because my primitive mind could not comprehend your worth. I threw the greatest mind in the history of this world into the freezing mud to protect my own fragile vanity." He leaned closer, resting his forehead gently against the heavy fur covering her shoulder. He did not care who saw his absolute submission. He did not care about Alpha pride. He only cared about the brilliant woman shivering beneath his coat. "I do not ask for your forgiveness, because I know I have not earned a single drop of it." Kael murmured, the heat of his breath warming her freezing cheek. "I only ask that you allow me to serve your mind. Let me be the brute force that builds your designs. Let my hands bleed so yours do not have to. I submit my crown, my life, and my soul to your absolute judgment." The violent tremors racking Valka's body slowly began to subside as the dense royal furs trapped her remaining body heat. The profound, quiet intimacy of his confession resonated deeply within her exhausted mind. He was not making empty royal promises. He had just used his massive strength to save her people, and he had stripped his own alpha status bare to keep her warm. The bitter ashes of his past rejection were slowly being replaced by the undeniable heat of a genuine equal partnership. But the quiet emotional sanctuary of the room was brutally shattered by a heavy, violent pounding on the reinforced exterior door. Kael turned his head, his silver eyes instantly hardening into lethal shards of ice. The mega blizzard was still screaming outside, but beneath the howling wind came the distinct, organized crunch of heavy iron boots marching through the deep snow. The door groaned loudly as a massive iron battering ram struck the wood. The corrupt elite from the freezing capital had finally arrived, and they had not come to beg for warmth. They had come to steal the fire. The heavy iron hinges of the exterior door shrieked under the violent impact of the battering ram. Kael did not hesitate. He lunged forward, his massive frame moving with terrifying speed, and slammed a thick oak crossbar into the iron brackets just as a secondary impact shuddered through the wood. Outside, the muffled, arrogant voice of Lord Thorn, the head of the royal council, cut clearly through the howling wind. "Open the door, King Kael. We have tracked your vanguard through the ice. We demand the peasant witch and her thermal formula. Hand over the Warmaker and the nobility will safely escort you back to the capital. The slums can freeze." Kael's jaw clenched. The very men who had hoarded the firewood and demanded Valka's exile were now demanding her salvation while leaving the innocent to die in the snow. "The capital is dead," Thorn Kael roared, his deep voice vibrating through the thick timber. "And if you try to breach this sanctuary, I will personally bury you in the ice." A heavy silence fell outside, masked only by the shrieking mega blizzard. The corrupt lords were retreating temporarily, likely seeking shelter in the abandoned outer cabins to prepare a heavier siege weapon. They had bought themselves a fragile window of time. Valka pushed herself off the wooden floor, the heavy royal furs still draped safely over her shoulders. She did not panic. Her brilliant mind instantly shifted from survival to tactical thermodynamics. The oak crossbar will not hold against the reinforced steel ram, she stated, walking toward her heavy iron mixing vats. We need to synthesize a hyperdense variant of the volcanic paste. If we compress the frost sap and apply it directly to the structural seams, it will cure into a thermal concrete. The door will become harder than solid stone. Tell me what to do, Kael said, stepping away from the reinforced door. He did not issue a royal decree. He awaited her absolute command. I need the deep earth pumice crushed to a fine powder, and the frost sap boiled down to a pure liquid resin, Valka instructed, pointing to the heavy sacks of raw material. It requires immense kinetic force. More than I have left in my arms. Kael stripped off his heavy leather tunic and his damp linen shirt, leaving his broad torso completely bare in the sweltering heat of the cabin. He approached the heavy iron mortar, his massive alpha muscles flexing violently as he grabbed the thick iron pestle. He brought it down, repeatedly crushing the raw volcanic rock with a raw rhythmic power. He was the invincible king of the realm, possessing unimaginable wealth and military supremacy, yet here he was happily reducing himself to a manual laborer to serve the brilliant mind of an exiled Omega. Valka watched him work. The ambient heat of the room coated his bare skin in a heavy sheen of sweat. He was covered in black soot and gray dust, the exact same filth he had once so arrogantly despised. Yet, as the firelight caught the hard lines of his chest, he looked more majestic, wielding a crushing pestle in a peasant cabin than he ever had sitting on a pristine golden throne. The resin is boiling, Valka said, carrying a heavy iron crucible toward the central mixing vat. Her hands trembled slightly from the lingering physical exhaustion of the rescue. Let me, Kael said softly. He dropped the heavy pestle and reached for the crucible. As their hands met around the heavy iron handle, a profound electric jolt sparked instantly between them. It was not the frantic primal biological urge of a standard mating bond. It was something infinitely deeper and heavier. It was a connection forged in the freezing dark, built on absolute mutual respect and shared survival. Kael did not let go of the crucible. His large, pristine fingers gently traced the rough, blistered scars on her knuckles. He mapped the deep calluses on her palms, the minor burns from the boiling resin, and the permanent soot stains that highlighted her towering intellect. I looked at these hands and saw imperfection, Kael murmured, his silver eyes locked intensely onto hers. I was entirely blind. These are the hands that held the fire when the rest of the world chose the dark. You survived the frozen hell I condemned you to, and you used your genius to build a paradise in the ice. They are the most magnificent creation I have ever seen. Valka felt a hot flush rise deep in her chest that had absolutely nothing to do with the sweltering thermal paste. The deep, agonizing wounds of her public rejection were finally knitting together, sealed entirely by the undeniable truth in his gaze. He was not just apologizing for his mistake. He was actively worshiping the very essence of who she truly was. The paste will cool if we do not mix it, Valka whispered, though she made absolutely no effort to pull her scarred hands away. Kael smiled, a rare, breathtaking expression that completely softened his harsh alpha features. Then command me, my queen. How do we build the shield? Together they poured the boiling resin into the crushed volcanic powder. They stood shoulder to shoulder over the heavy architectural blueprints spread across the wooden table, their arms brushing constantly as Valka pointed out the critical structural load points of the heavy. The intense physical labor and the sweltering heat stripped away the last remaining barriers between them. There were no royal titles in this room, no Alpha or Omega, only two equals fighting side by side to protect. Kael followed her complex geometry, flawlessly sinking his bare hands deep into the scalding gray mortar and slapping it heavily against the wooden beams. They moved in perfect synchronized harmony. Her towering intellect mapped the physical world, and his unstoppable alpha strength bent the raw materials to her precise will. They sealed the final iron hinge, just as the hyperdense thermal concrete began to cure, transforming the flimsy peasant door into an impenetrable fortress wall. Kael stepped back, his broad chest heaving, his body completely covered in the thick gray paste. He looked exhausted, filthy, and absolutely triumphant. Valka reached out, taking a clean strip of linen and gently wiped a dark streak of black soot from his strong jaw. Kael leaned heavily into her touch, closing his eyes and letting out a deep, shuddering breath as the primal bond between them finally clicked perfectly into place. But the quiet, beautiful, emotional sanctuary was abruptly broken. Outside the heavily reinforced door, the sharp, unmistakable mechanical sound of a heavy ballista being cranked into position echoed through the howling wind. The corrupt elite were not just trying to break the door down anymore. They were preparing to shatter the entire cabin. The heavy thud of the ballista firing shook the frozen earth, A massive iron-tipped bolt slammed against the reinforced door with a deafening crack. The hyper-dense thermal concrete held flawlessly, completely absorbing the kinetic impact, but the surrounding rotting timber of the peasant cabin groaned in terrifying protest. Dust and gray ash rained down from the ceiling, covering the architectural blueprints scattered across the wooden table. Valka stood perfectly still, her pale eyes locked on the trembling wood. The mega blizzard screaming outside was a mindless force of nature operating purely on the mathematical laws of atmospheric pressure and temperature. It harbored no malice, but the men standing outside her door represented a far more dangerous threat. They represented the absolute toxic greed of the Alpha elite. Lord Thorn and his corrupt councilmen had abandoned thousands of dying citizens in the capital, choosing instead to march into the freezing wasteland, simply to hoard the very salvation they had once cast away. "Open the door, King Kael." Lord Thorn's voice was distorted by the howling wind but dripping with unyielding arrogance. "You have hidden the peasant witch long enough. The capital is a graveyard and the royal reserves are nearly depleted. The nobility requires the thermal formula immediately." Kael moved toward the door, his broad chest heaving. The thick layer of gray volcanic paste coating his bare skin cracked slightly as his massive muscles flexed in raw lethal fury. He gripped the heavy oak crossbar, his silver eyes burning with a dark, violent promise. "The formula does not belong to the nobility," Thorn Kael roared, his voice vibrating through the thick, reinforced timber. "It belongs to the minds that created it and the people who need it to survive. You will not steal the warmth while the innocent freeze." A cruel, sharp laugh echoed from the other side of the door. "The innocent are entirely expendable, my king." Thorn countered, his tone completely devoid of human empathy. "The natural order dictates that the strong survive and the weak perish. We are the elite. We are the foundation of this empire. If this Omega has discovered a method to conquer the ice, that knowledge belongs exclusively to the crown. We will insulate the grand pavilions and let the outer rim return to the dirt where they belong. Hand over the formula and the witch, and we will spare this miserable village. Refuse and my ballista will shatter every single cabin in this frozen slum." Valka felt a sickening twist in her stomach. The profound cruelty of the royal council was staggering. They had watched their own soldiers freeze to death in the marble courtyards, yet they still clung desperately to their archaic hierarchy. They did not want to save the kingdom. They only wanted to save themselves. If she surrendered the volcanic pumice and the frost sap, the elite would hoard the materials exactly as they had hoarded the firewood. Her little sister Alara had frozen to death because of that exact same greed. Valka swore to the universe that she would never let history repeat itself. She looked at Kael. The invincible king was vibrating with a murderous rage, ready to tear the door open and slaughter his own corrupted council with his bare hands. But stepping out into the blinding whiteout against heavily armed alpha lords and a loaded ballista was a suicide mission. The cold would devour his unprotected skin before he could even reach Thorn. Valka stepped forward, resting her scarred hand gently against Kael's tense back. Her touch was light, but it carried the immense grounding weight of her towering intellect. "We do not fight them with iron," Valka whispered, her voice steady and perfectly calm. "If you open that door, the atmospheric vacuum will equalize violently and the freezing wind will slaughter everyone in this room. We cannot engage them in a primitive physical brawl. They operate entirely on brute force and blind intimidation. We must operate on superior mechanics." Kael turned his head, looking down at her pale, focused eyes. His alpha instinct screamed at him to protect his mate, to rip the throat out of any man who dared threaten her existence. But he had already surrendered his primitive pride to her brilliant mind. He forced his heavy breathing to slow, submitting entirely to her tactical judgment. "What is your command, my queen?" Kael asked, his voice a low, heavy rumble that resonated deep in her chest. Valka walked away from the reinforced door, moving toward the central barometric column. She analyzed the rapid dropping pressure and the precise ambient temperature inside the sweltering cabin. The geothermal physics of the northern ice caves were not just designed to trap heat. When manipulated correctly, extreme thermal pressure could be weaponized into an unstoppable kinetic force. "They want the thermal formula," Valka stated, her eyes narrowing as she calculated the fluid dynamics of the boiling resin still bubbling in the heavy iron mixing vat. "They want to steal the fire and leave my people in the dark. I'm going to show them exactly what happens when you try to cage the heat." She grabbed a heavy copper coil and a sealed iron pressure valve, moving with frantic mechanical precision. Kael watched in profound awe as she rapidly assembled a complex network of brass pipes, connecting the boiling volcanic resin directly to the narrow viewing pane of the reinforced wooden door. She was not building a shield anymore. She was engineering a devastating thermodynamic cannon. Another massive iron-tipped bolt slammed into the exterior wall. The heavy timber groaned violently, and a large crack spider-webbed across the ceiling. The ballista was slowly tearing the physical structure of the cabin apart. "We are losing the load-bearing beams," Kael warned, stepping carefully to support a sagging wooden pillar with his massive shoulders. "The roof will not survive a third impact." Valka tightened the final brass fitting with a heavy iron wrench. The pressure inside the copper coils shrieked a high-pitched, terrifying whine as the boiling liquid expanded rapidly against the confined metal. She placed her scarred hand heavily on the primary release valve. "Let them break the wood," Valka declared, her voice carrying the absolute unyielding authority of a true sovereign. "The wood is just a shell. The real power is in the pressure." Outside, Lord Thorn issued the final devastating order. The heavy mechanical gears of the ballista cranked loudly, echoing through the howling storm. The corrupt elite were preparing to fire a massive incendiary payload, entirely determined to burn the Warmaker alive if she refused to submit. "Let us see if your magic can survive the fire, witch," Thorn bellowed, his cruel voice completely swallowed by the sound of the approaching strike. The heavy ballista mechanism snapped with a terrifying metallic twang. A massive iron-tipped bolt, completely engulfed in roaring pitch fire, launched through the blinding whiteout aimed directly at the center of the reinforced door. Valka did not flinch. She gripped the heavy iron release valve and twisted it completely open. The highly pressurized boiling resin and volcanic steam trapped inside the copper coils exploded outward through the narrow viewing pane. The intense thermal jet collided exactly with the flying incendiary bolt in midair. The sudden violent clash of extreme atmospheric pressure and raw heat created a massive kinetic shockwave. A deafening thermodynamic detonation rocked the entire village. The heavy oak door was blown entirely outward, shattering into hundreds of burning splinters that rained down into the freezing mud. Thick gray steam billowed violently into the screaming blizzard, creating a massive swirling pocket of sweltering heat directly in the snow. The blinding whiteout was temporarily pushed back by the sheer magnitude of the thermal blast. Valka stepped forward, walking over the shattered threshold and standing directly in the freezing snow. The residual heat from the volcanic blast wrapped around her small frame like an invisible heavy cloak. Kael moved instantly, stepping out into the storm right beside. His broad, bare torso was completely covered in the cured gray thermal concrete, making him look like an ancient, unstoppable war god forged directly from earth and fire. A few yards away, Lord Thorn and his corrupt elite guards were scrambling to their feet. The kinetic shockwave had thrown them violently into the deep snowdrifts. Thorn's luxurious velvet cloak was heavily singed, and his arrogant face was pale with absolute shock. He had expected to find a terrified, fragile Omega cowering behind a wooden door. Instead, he was facing a towering intellectual sovereign who had just weaponized the very air they breathed. "You're entirely mad," Thorn sputtered, his voice trembling as he brushed the freezing snow from his singed coat. "You dare attack the Royal Council? You're guilty of absolute high treason. Hand over the thermal blueprints immediately, or I will have you executed in this very snowdrift." Valka looked at the ancient Alpha Lord, her pale eyes completely devoid of fear. "You marched over the frozen bodies of your own soldiers to come here, Thorn. You abandoned the capital and left innocent peasants to die in the dark. You're not a leader. You're a parasite feeding on an empire you're completely incapable of sustaining." The truth of her words cut through the howling wind with piercing absolute clarity. The freezing wind tore at the guards, attempting to freeze the marrow inside their bones. The metal of their drawn swords was already coated in a thick layer of blue frost, rendering the blades heavy and sluggish in their entirely numb hands. They were freezing to death, despite their stolen furs, and they could physically feel the miraculous heat radiating from the small peasant woman standing in the snow. "I will not surrender the science of survival to men who only know how to destroy," Valka declared, her voice resonating with an undeniable, towering authority. "The frost sap and the pumice belong to the people. The era of the elite hoarding the fire is officially over. If you want to survive this winter, you will learn to share the hearth, or you will freeze in the dark." Thorn's face twisted into a mask of ugly, toxic fury. His absolute authority was being publicly dismantled by a soot-stained outcast. He drew his heavy iron sword, the freezing metal gleaming dully in the gray light. "Seize the witch," Thorn screamed, pointing his trembling blade directly at Valka's chest. "Kill anyone who stands in your way and tear the blueprints from her dead hands." The elite royal guards hesitated for a fraction of a second, caught between the blinding storm and the terrifying heat, but their lifelong conditioning to obey the corrupt council overpowered their hesitation. 12 heavily armed alpha warriors gripped their frozen swords and began to advance through the deep snow, their heavy boots crunching menacingly toward the fragile Omega. Kael did not issue a royal command. He did not pull rank or demand their submission. He simply acted. The king reached down into the smoking rubble of the shattered threshold and wrapped his massive hands around a jagged heavy iron crossbar. He ripped the thick metal free from the burning wood with a deafening screech of tearing iron. He stepped deliberately directly in front of Valka, completely shielding her fragile frame with his own massive body. He raised the jagged iron bar, his silver eyes burning with a lethal dark promise. He was entirely unarmed, bare-chested, and covered in gray soot, but the raw predatory aura radiating from his stance was infinitely more terrifying than 1,000 polished swords. Kael seemed entirely immune to the White Death. The volcanic paste clinging to his skin radiated a faint, terrifying heat, and his blood pumped with the fierce protective instinct of an alpha defending his absolute equal. "You will not take a single step closer to my Queen Kael," rumbled his deep voice, carrying a horrific, unyielding violence that paralyzed the advancing guards. Thorn laughed, a bitter, desperate sound. "You're a broken King Kael. You have no armor and no army. You cannot defend her against 12 elite swordsmen with a piece of scrap metal." "I do not need an army," Kael replied, his grip tightening on the heavy iron bar until his knuckles turned completely white. "I only need a single strike to shatter your corrupt skull thorn." The royal guards raised their freezing iron blades, preparing to charge the bare-chested Alpha. The mega blizzard screamed violently above them, perfectly mirroring the brutal physical clash that was about to erupt in the deep snow. The 12 royal guards surged forward, their heavy boots tearing through the deep snowdrifts. Kael braced his massive frame, his silver eyes locked on the leading soldier, entirely prepared to shatter bone with the jagged iron crossbar. But Valka refused to let her sanctuary become a bloody graveyard. She refused to let the man who had just surrendered his alpha pride die in the snow to protect her. She reached out, her scarred hand gripping Kael's tense forearm with surprising strength, pulling him back a single crucial step. "Do not strike them," Valka commanded, her voice cutting sharply through the deafening roar of the mega blizzard. "Iron is a primitive tool. Let the earth fight for us." Kael did not hesitate. He lowered the heavy crossbar, instantly yielding to her tactical authority. Valka dropped to her knees in the freezing mud right beside the shattered threshold. Her brilliant mind rapidly calculated the exact geographical coordinates of the village square. She had not simply painted the peasant cabins with volcanic. She had engineered an intricate subterranean network of pressurized copper pipes connecting every single structure to the deep geothermal vents beneath the mountain. The very ground the corrupt elite were standing on was a massive sleeping thermal battery, holding an unimaginable amount of radiant kinetic energy. She brushed away a thick layer of snow and jagged ice, revealing a heavy brass master release valve buried deep in the frozen dirt. It was the emergency pressure lock designed to vent excess geothermal steam if the subterranean pipes ever dangerously overheated. Thorn laughed, his voice dripping with venomous triumph as he watched her kneel in the mud. "Are you praying to the dirt witch? The ice does not listen to peasant prayers. Take her head." The guards closed the distance, their frozen swords raised high, ready to execute the fatal strike. Valka gripped the heavy iron wrench, still resting in her leather satchel. She did not pray. She calculated the exact atmospheric density of the ambient freezing air directly above the valve. She locked the heavy wrench onto the brass fitting and pulled backward with every ounce of physical strength remaining in her exhausted body. The brass valve screamed an agonizing metallic shriek as the heavy mechanical seal broke entirely open. It was not a blast of fire. It was an absolute geyser of pure hyper-pressurized geothermal steam. The trapped subterranean heat, originally meant to warm 50 cabins, simultaneously exploded upward through the frozen dirt with the kinetic force of an erupting volcano. The blinding whiteout of the blizzard was instantly swallowed by a towering, impenetrable cloud of boiling gray vapor. The thermal shock waves slammed directly into the charging guards. The extreme sudden shift from sub-zero atmospheric pressure to scalding ambient heat created a devastating physical reaction. The massive iron swords gripped tightly in their hands acted as flawless thermal conductors. The freezing metal instantly absorbed the staggering heat, turning scalding hot within a fraction of a second. Agonized screams echoed through the dense gray vapor. The elite alpha warriors dropped their weapons instinctively, their blistered palms completely unable to hold the searing iron. Heavy swords clattered uselessly into the melting snowdrifts. The disorienting, suffocating wall of thick steam blinded them entirely, stripping away their spatial awareness and throwing their elite military conditioning into absolute chaos. They collapsed to their knees in the mud, coughing violently as the heavy ozone-filled air filled their freezing lungs. They were completely neutralized without a single drop of blood being spilled. Valka had disarmed the most lethal soldiers in the kingdom, using nothing but the invisible mathematical laws of thermodynamics. The heavy gray steam slowly began to dissipate, rising up to meet the churning black clouds of the mega blizzard. Valka stood up, her dark hair plastered to her damp forehead, her chest heaving with exhaustion. She looked at the kneeling, defeated guard. They were staring at their blistered hands in absolute terrified awe. They finally realized they were fighting a woman who could literally command the earth to boil the weapons right out of their grip. Lord Thorn stood alone at the edge of the melted snowbank. His arrogant velvet cloak was soaked and heavy, dragging pathetically in the mud. His personal elite guard was entirely broken. He looked at the fragile Omega standing beside the bare-chested Alpha King, realizing that his era of absolute dominance was finished. But the toxic greed of a desperate man was a terrifying, unpredictable force. Thorn reached inside his soaked tunic, his eyes burning with a manic, cornered desperation. He pulled a hidden mechanism from his belt, a small, heavy iron tube packed with concentrated black powder, aiming it directly at Valka's heart. The heavy iron tube in Thorn's hand was a crude but lethal weapon capable of firing a lead ball right through a human chest. Valka saw the manic desperation in his eyes, the absolute toxic refusal to surrender his unearned power. She had exhausted her geothermal traps. The physical distance between them was too short for another mechanical calculation. But she did not need a mechanical calculation. She had the Alpha King. Kael moved with a terrifying blur of raw kinetic speed, completely ignoring the freezing mud and the howling wind. He did not draw a blade, he did not hesitate. His massive hand clamped directly over the heavy iron tube just as Thorn pulled the primitive firing mechanism. A muffled crack echoed inside Kael's enclosed fist. The concentrated black powder detonated directly against his palm, but the thick layer of cured volcanic concrete coating his skin acted as a flawless physical shield. The lead ball flattened uselessly against the hyper-dense material, dropping harmlessly into the snow. Thorn stared in absolute horrified disbelief at the smoking iron tube. Before the corrupt lord could take a single step backward, Kael gripped him by the collar of his luxurious velvet cloak. The massive Alpha lifted the ancient councilman completely off the frozen ground, his silver eyes burning with a cold, absolute judgment. Kael did not strike him. He simply dropped Thorn into the freezing mud, treating him with the exact same dismissive contempt the elite had shown the outer rim peasants for centuries. The village square was entirely silent save for the shrieking wind of the mega blizzard. The terrified peasants slowly emerged from the intact insulated cabins, standing in the narrow covered trenches to witness the unprecedented scene. The surviving royal guards remained on their knees, clutching their blistered hands, their heads bowed in absolute defeat. Kael turned his back on the broken, corrupt councilman. He walked slowly back to the shattered threshold where Valka stood. The king of the realm, the invincible conqueror, who had once demanded perfect aesthetic submission, dropped slowly to one knee in the freezing mud directly in front of the entire impoverished village. A collective gasp rippled through the gathered peasants. An Alpha King did not kneel. It was a complete, absolute violation of every archaic law written in the grand marble pavilion. Kael looked up at Valka, his silver eyes stripped entirely of their former arrogance. He did not see a filthy mechanic anymore. He saw a towering sovereign of the physical world. My crown was forged from stolen gold and blind tradition. Kael spoke, his deep voice carrying effortlessly across the quiet square, carrying an emotional weight that silenced the roaring storm. My empire was built on the broken backs of the innocent. I was the architect of my own frozen ruin. I threw the greatest mind in history into the dark because I was too primitive to understand the light. He reached out gently, taking her heavily scarred, blistered hands in his massive, pristine palms. He pressed his lips reverently against the dark soot stains, worshipping the very marks he had once despised. I formally renounce the ancient Alpha laws, Kael declared, his voice echoing with undeniable absolute conviction. The era of the elite hoarding the fire is dead. I bind my raw physical strength entirely to your towering intellect. I will be the iron that builds your designs. I will be the shield that protects your sanctuary. I submit my entire existence to your supreme authority, Valka. I'm yours to command. Valka looked down at the massive Alpha kneeling in the mud. The primal biological bond in her chest, which had been a source of agonizing pain for months, finally blossomed into a profound, radiant. The physical chill of the mega blizzard completely vanished, replaced by the absolute, undeniable truth of his vow. He was not asking her to return to the shadows of the marble pavilion. He was offering her the entire world on a silver platter, ready to burn his own kingdom down just to keep her warm. She gently squeezed his large hands, her pale eyes reflecting the soft orange glow of the surviving hearts. Rise, Kael, Valka, commanded her voice, a perfectly calm anchor in the center of the storm. We have an empire to rebuild. Kael stood up, his broad chest heaving, pulling her gently against his massive frame. The storm around them reached its absolute catastrophic apex, howling with mindless fury, but within the protective circle of his arms and the impenetrable heat of her scientific genius, the White Death had fundamentally lost. They were an unstoppable fusion of raw kinetic power and supreme mathematical brilliance. The massive convoy of heavy wooden wagons crawled through the frozen gates of the capital city. It was a terrifying mechanical procession tearing through the dying remnants of the mega blizzard. Every single wagon was coated in a thick, impenetrable layer of the gray volcanic. The massive draft horses wore specialized thermal armor crafted from the same miraculous paste, their heavy hooves cracking the solid ice covering the cobblestone streets. Valka sat beside Kael on the lead wagon, her heavy thermal coat wrapping her in absolute swelter. She looked up at the towering marble spires. The last time she had walked these streets, she was a fragile, weeping outcast, shivering in a ceremonial silk gown. She had been invisible, entirely erased by a society that valued empty aesthetic perfection. Now she was returning as the undisputed master of the physical world, bringing the exact salvation the elite had violently rejected. The irony tasted like sharp, cold iron on her tongue. The royal convoy halted directly in front of the grand marble pavilion. The massive golden doors designed to project absolute military supremacy were frozen half open, wedged in place by feet of solid blue ice. Kael leapt down from the wagon, lifting his broad arms to help Valka descend. He did not issue any royal commands to the surviving soldiers scattered around the courtyard. He simply stayed exactly one step behind his queen, acting as the immovable physical anchor for her towering intellect. They walked through the frozen golden doors, stepping into a scene of absolute pathetic devastation. The Grand Hall, once the epicenter of infinite wealth and arrogant tradition, was now a freezing tomb. The remaining members of the High Council and the elite courtiers were huddled together in the center of the vast marble floor. They had burned their priceless tapestries, their ancient wooden thrones, and their historical archives in a massive, desperate bonfire that was already rapidly. The sheer architectural volume of the vaulted ceiling was swallowing the heat faster than the fire could generate it. Elder Vane, the oldest and most arrogant alpha of the political court, looked up from the dying embers. His purple velvet robes were stiff with blue frost, and his lips trembled violently. When his pale eyes registered the towering figure of King Kael, a brief spark of desperate hope ignited in his freezing face. "My King," Vane rasped his voice, a hollow, pathetic echo in the massive chamber. "You have returned. We received reports that Lord Thorn was lost in the wastes. You must order the immediate confiscation of the northern timber reserves. The palace requires fuel." Vane's eyes then shifted, landing directly on the small, soot-stained woman standing right beside the king. The desperate hope in the elder's face instantly curdled into toxic, aristocratic outrage. "Why is the exiled Omega standing in the sacred pavilion?" Vane demanded, his archaic pride completely overriding his basic survival instincts. "She is a blemish on the court. Have the royal guards throw her back into the snow immediately." Kael did not draw his sword. He did not need to. He looked at the freezing elder with absolute cold pity. "The royal guards answer to the Warmaker now, Vane. And if you speak to my queen with that tone again, I will personally throw you into the snow." Vane physically recoiled, staggering backward against a frozen marble pillar. The absolute biological shock of an Alpha King publicly submitting to an exiled Omega shattered the fragile remaining fragments of his aristocratic reality. Valka stepped forward, walking directly toward the dying massive bonfire. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to scream to project absolute authority. She reached into her leather satchel and pulled out a heavy raw chunk of the volcanic pumice, dropping it directly onto the frozen marble floor right at Vane's feet. "You are freezing to death because you fundamentally misunderstand the nature of power," Valka stated, her voice echoing with piercing absolute clarity through the silent pavilion. "You build a massive fire and expect the air to submit to your royal decrees. You burn history and art simply to warm your hands for a few pathetic minutes. Your traditional methods are mathematically useless." She pointed to the towering, drafty ceiling. "Heat rises, Vane. It follows the path of least resistance. You're feeding all of your precious energy directly to the storm while your people die on the floor." Vane stared at the gray rock on the floor, his teeth chattering violently. "We are the ruling class. We dictate the laws of this empire. We do not take architectural lessons from a filthy mechanic." Valka did not flinch at the insult. She looked at the shivering, pathetic men surrounding the dying fire. "The laws of this empire are dead," Valka declared, her pale eyes sweeping across the frozen courtiers. "The sky does not care about your purple velvet. The dropping barometric pressure does not respect your ancient bloodlines. You have hoarded the wealth of this kingdom for centuries, and it has brought you absolutely nothing but a frozen tomb. She took another step forward, her presence radiating an undeniable, impossible warmth that the freezing nobles could physically feel. I have the thermal formula, Valka continued, her tone leveling into a cold, absolute ultimatum. I brought enough of the synthesized volcanic paste to insulate this entire pavilion and save every single life in this room. But I will not apply a single drop of it to these walls while you hold political power. Vane gasped, clutching his frozen velvet robes. You would commit treason. You would let the High Council freeze. I would let the arrogance freeze, Valka corrected, her voice sharp and unyielding as a diamond drill. I'm offering you a very simple mathematical equation. You can either formally surrender your political seats, surrender your hoarded wealth, and submit to a new era of equal survival, or you can keep your empty titles and die in the dark. A terrifying, agonizing silence filled the massive grand hall. The dying bonfire let out a pathetic crackle, its final embers fading into black ash. The ambient temperature in the pavilion plummeted violently, dropping past the threshold of human endurance. Vane looked at the impenetrable gray thermal composite waiting just outside the frozen golden doors, and then up at the towering ceiling of the grand hall. A massive jagged crack had formed in the vaulted marble directly above their heads, weakened by the catastrophic atmospheric pressure. The ceiling was preparing to collapse directly onto the High Council, and Valka was their only shield. The massive jagged crack in the vaulted marble ceiling groaned violently, echoing like a dying beast through the freezing pavilion. A shower of white dust and sharp ice shards rained down directly onto the High. The absolute physical reality of their impending death finally shattered the archaic delusions of the elite alphas. They were not untouchable gods. They were fragile, freezing men entirely at the mercy of the sky. Elder Vane collapsed to his knees on the frozen marble floor, his purple velvet robes pooling in the gray ash of the dead bonfire. He did not look like a supreme political ruler anymore. He looked exactly like the terrified, impoverished peasants he had systematically oppressed for decades. I surrender, Vane gasped, his voice a broken, pathetic wheeze. We surrender the seats. We surrender the hoarded wealth. Just give us the warmth. Please give us the fire. One by one, the remaining elite courtiers dropped to their knees, burying their freezing faces in their hands. The absolute biological submission of the Alpha ruling class to a banished Omega was complete. Valka looked down at the kneeling men. She felt no vindictive joy or cruel triumph. She only felt a profound, heavy closure. The ghost of her little sister freezing on the dirt floor could finally rest. The men who had stolen the firewood were begging for a single spark of her genius, and she was going to give it to them on her exact terms. Kael stepped forward, his massive physical presence dominating the silent hall. He looked at the kneeling council, his silver eyes completely devoid of mercy. Your hoarded gold will be melted down, Kael declared, his deep voice vibrating with absolute authority. Your massive estates will be dismantled and repurposed as public sanctuaries. The royal treasury no longer belongs to the bloodlines. It belongs entirely to the infrastructure of survival. Warmth is no longer a luxury reserved for the elite. It is a fundamental human right. He turned to his surviving royal guards who were watching the unprecedented political shift with absolute reverence. Strip them of their signet rings, Kael commanded. Empty the royal vaults and begin loading the gold onto the northern wagons. We have an entire continent to insulate. The guards moved instantly, carrying out the orders without a single second of hesitation. They were no longer serving a blind tradition. They were serving the tangible, life-saving power of the new regime. Kael turned away from the broken council and offered his large hand to Valka. He did not lead her toward the dying bonfire. He led her toward the elevated golden dais at the far end of the grand hall. It was the exact same dais where she had stood 3 years ago, wearing a suffocating silk gown, listening to the crushing words of her public rejection. The steps were coated in a thick layer of blue ice, but Kael walked her up the freezing stairs with absolute steady care, ensuring she did not. They reached the summit of the dais, standing directly in front of the massive golden throne. Kael did not sit down. He did not claim his traditional seat of power. Instead, the invincible Alpha King turned to face the entire gathered hall and dropped heavily to one knee right beside the throne. He looked up at Valka, his silver eyes reflecting the brilliant, terrifying intellect shining in her pale gaze. I was a fool who worshipped an empty crown, Kael spoke, his voice echoing through the vast marble chamber, carrying the undeniable weight of absolute devotion. I demanded aesthetic perfection when the world desperately needed a savior. You are the architect of our survival. You're the master of the physical world. I do not offer you a place beside me. I ask for a place beside you. He reached into his heavy thermal coat and pulled out the ancient royal diadem. It was a heavy band of raw iron and jagged diamonds, a symbol of brutal military conquest. Kael did not place it on his own head. He extended it upward, offering the absolute supreme authority of the kingdom directly to her soot-stained hands. "I crown you the supreme sovereign of this empire." Kael declared, his words carving a permanent new law into the history of their world. "You are the Warmaker. You are the queen of the hearth. May your brilliant mind rule us until the end of days." Valka looked at the heavy iron diadem resting in his large, pristine palms. She did not take the crown to wear it. She reached out and rested her scarred, blistered fingers gently over his hands, completely rejecting the archaic symbol of power while accepting the massive responsibility it represented. "I do not need a piece of iron to rule Valka," replied her voice, a calm, perfectly clear anchor in the freezing room. "I need your strength to build." She turned her gaze away from the kneeling king and looked out over the massive frozen pavilion. Her clinical mind was already rapidly calculating the sheer logistical magnitude of the impending labor. The capital was a labyrinth of drafty stone and useless high ceilings. It would require millions of pounds of the volcanic composite and thousands of hours of relentless, brutal work to trap the heat and save the remaining population. "Bring the heavy iron mixing vats into the grand courtyard," Valka commanded, her voice suddenly shifting from quiet acceptance to absolute towering authority. "Smash the marble statues and grind the stone into a binding powder. We are going to seal every single draft in this dead city. No one sleeps until the thermal vacuum is secure." The royal guards and the surviving courtiers scrambled to obey, driven by the absolute undeniable truth of her genius. The invisible outcast had officially taken control of the world, and the agonizing slow burn of their survival was finally about to begin. The grand marble pavilion, once a pristine monument to Alpha vanity, was entirely unrecognizable. It had become a sprawling, sweltering industrial forge of absolute survival. The delicate silk banners that had shattered in the freezing wind were permanently replaced by massive heavy canvas tarps designed to trap the ambient heat. The towering statues of ancient kings were completely gone, pulverized into fine binding dust by the very alphas who used to worship them. Valka stood on the elevated balcony of the royal courtyard, looking down at the magnificent, chaotic symphony of her thermodynamic revolution. Her mind was a relentless engine of progress. Former elite councilmen whose hands had never known a single day of hard physical labor were now sinking elbow deep into heavy iron vats of boiling volcanic resin. They worked shoulder to shoulder with the surviving peasants of the Outer Rim, their luxurious purple velvet ruined and replaced by thick functional canvas. There was no hierarchy in the mixing lines. The plunging barometric pressure outside remained a constant lethal threat, but inside the massive courtyard, the only law that mattered was the precise mathematical ratio of frost sap to crushed pumice. Valka watched Elder Vane, struggling to haul a heavy sack of raw material, his face coated in thick gray soot. He did not complain. The sheer terrifying reality of the White Death had permanently erased his toxic aristocratic pride. She unrolled a massive architectural schematic across the heavy wooden railing, her scarred hands tracing the complex thermal vectors of the transformed capital. Retrofitting a sprawling, drafty stone city was a monumental logistical nightmare. The ancient castle walls were highly porous, acting as giant sponges that absorbed the freezing atmospheric pressure. Valka calculated the exact load-bearing weak points, directing her specialized engineering teams to inject the hyperdense thermal concrete directly into the deep structural foundations. Every single exterior window was sealed with a thick, translucent resin compound, allowing the pale winter light to enter while completely blocking the kinetic transfer of the lethal cold. Kael emerged from the lower catacombs, his broad chest heaving under the immense weight of a massive iron cauldron. His skin was permanently stained with the gray mortar, a visual testament to his absolute, unwavering dedication to her vision. He hoisted the heavy vat onto a stone platform with a deep, rumbling grunt, directing a team of royal guards to begin sealing the lower military barracks. The Alpha King did not sit on a golden throne issuing blind decrees. He was the prime kinetic engine driving her thermodynamic designs, carrying the absolute heaviest physical burdens, so her mind could remain entirely focused on the geometry of their survival. He looked up, catching her pale eyes from across the sweltering courtyard. He offered a slow, exhausted nod of absolute reverence, sending a profound, heavy wave of warmth straight through her chest. Within 3 grueling weeks, the impossible was officially achieved. The freezing death toll that had decimated the entire northern continent abruptly completely stopped. Not a single soul perished to the cold within the newly insulated walls of the capital. The lethal whiteout continued to rage with apocalyptic fury against the gray outer shell of the transformed city, but inside the air was thick, sweltering, and fiercely alive. The invisible Banished Omega, who had been violently cast out for her soot-stained hands, was now universally worshipped as a living deity. As Valka walked through the crowded insulated corridors, the citizens did not bow out of forced political fear. They dropped to their knees in genuine weeping gratitude, pressing their warm hands against their chests to honor the brilliant mind that kept their hearts beating. Valka paused near a massive communal hearth, watching a group of young children laughing as they played on the sweltering stone floor. One of the little girls had dark hair and pale eyes, a beautiful haunting reflection of the little sister she had lost to the cold so many years ago. The phantom ache in Valka's chest, the heavy crushing guilt of failing to save Ilara, finally began to dissolve into the hot air. She could not change the brutal tragedy of her past, but she had successfully rewritten the future of her entire world. She had literally changed the laws of the physical world, ensuring that the elite could never again hoard the fire while the innocent perished in the dark. Kael approached her, his heavy boots echoing softly on the warm stone. He stopped right beside her, his massive frame radiating a steady, comforting heat that perfectly matched the ambient temperature. He reached out, gently wrapping his large soot-stained fingers around her heavily scarred hand. The primal biological bond between them was no longer a forced chemical reaction dictated by ancient alpha laws. It was a perfect forged union of supreme intellect and unstoppable kinetic strength, completely earned through mutual sacrifice and shared survival. The skies above the capital are beginning to crack, Kael murmured, looking up at the thick, translucent resin sealing the vaulted ceiling. The barometric columns in the outer ring are registering a massive atmospheric shift. The 100-year freeze is finally breaking its hold on the continent. We have survived the White Death, my queen, but now we must decide exactly what kind of world we are going to build when the blinding snow finally melts and the earth breathes again. 7 years had passed since the sky tried to freeze the world and failed against the towering intellect of a single discarded Omega. The capital city was no longer a towering monument to arrogant alpha vanity and drafty marble. It was a sprawling, vibrant paradise of sweltering life, completely insulated against the harsh returning winters. Even in the deepest months of the dark season, when the snow piled high against the outer walls, the inner courtyards flourished. Lush green vines crawled up the gray volcanic thermal concrete, and tropical flowers bloomed directly beneath the massive translucent resin ceilings. The physical world had been permanently tamed by the absolute mathematical mastery of the Warmaker. Valka stood on the sweeping balcony of the newly christened Grand Academy of Thermodynamics, her pale eyes watching the thriving city below. The ancient political council of corrupt, hoarding alphas had been entirely dissolved. In its place, a new equal council governed the realm, consisting of brilliant engineers, hardened northern survivors, and dedicated scholars. Wealth was no longer measured in useless hoarded gold or heavy iron swords. True currency was defined by intellectual contribution, structural integrity, and the sacred preservation of the communal hearth. She rested her hands on the warm stone railing. They were still heavily scarred and permanently stained with faint traces of gray soot and volcanic mortar. She had absolutely refused to let the royal healers attempt to fade the mark. The scars were the living physical history of her survival, the exact undeniable proof that absolute power did not come from a pristine bloodline, but from hands willing to bleed for the innocent. A loud, joyful laugh echoed from the massive courtyard below, pulling her attention downward. A group of young students wearing thick, practical canvas aprons were huddled around a large brass barometric column, completely engrossed in measuring ambient thermal radiation. Right in the center of the group stood a young girl with dark hair and bright, piercing silver eyes. Princess Ilara, named in sacred memory of the sister stolen by the cold, was completely covered in black soot. She was furiously calculating a complex thermodynamic equation on a heavy slate board, her small hands moving with the exact same frantic mechanical genius that had once saved the entire kingdom. Kael stepped out onto the balcony, his heavy boots completely silent against the warm floor. The invincible king wore simple woven tunics, now leaving his broad chest comfortably bare to the sweltering ambient heat of the sanctuary. He wrapped his massive arms around Valka's waist, pulling her back against his solid chest, resting his chin gently on the top of her head. Our daughter has managed to synthesize a highly unstable compound of frost sap and powdered sulfur, Kael murmured, his deep voice vibrating pleasantly against her spine. Her instructors are terrified. She is going to blow the roof off the southern wing, but they are entirely too mesmerized by her mathematics to stop her. Valka smiled, leaning back into his absolute, unwavering strength. The roof is heavily reinforced, she replied, her voice carrying the calm, quiet satisfaction of a world built perfectly to scale. Let her experiment. The future requires minds willing to push the boundaries of the pressure. Kael turned her gently around, lifting her scarred hand to press a deep, reverent kiss against her calloused palm. He looked at her with the exact same absolute awe he had felt the night he woke up in her freezing mud cabin. I look at our world, and I still cannot fully comprehend the magnitude of what you built, my queen. You took an empire of absolute freezing darkness and turned it into an eternal summer. You proved that the greatest power in the universe is a mind that refuses to break. Valka looked into the silver eyes of the man who had surrendered his entire archaic reality to worship her intellect. The agonizing wounds of her past public rejection were completely gone, replaced entirely by the undeniable roaring fire of their earned equality. They were the perfect, undeniable fusion of supreme kinetic strength and towering scientific genius. She rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady, powerful rhythm of his beating heart, knowing that as long as they stood together, the White Death would never claim another soul. Her story has come to an end, but our journey together continues. If you found this story inspiring and meaningful, please like the video to support me. Do not forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you do not miss the next empowering stories. And if you have any thoughts about the characters, her journey, or want to share your own story, please comment below. I really look forward to reading and chatting with you. Disclaimer: this video is a work of fiction, created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, settings, and events depicted are entirely imaginary and are not intended to represent real-life people or situations. Please view for entertainment purposes only.